Good afternoon and welcome to today's SurvivorCircle session, Understanding and De-Escalating Emotional Crisis. We're very glad to have you join us today from wherever you are and hope that you're well. We are again very pleased to have Dr. Melanie Varney join us today for the presentation. If you've not joined us before, just a little note about how to participate in today's session. On the Survivor Space page that you're on, you should be able to see this live stream in a small square. If you would like to see it larger, you can click on a little box in the corner of that square and it will enlarge to fill up your screen. And if you would like to submit a question or a comment or participate in the discussion today, there is a chat box on the page that will allow you to participate anonymously. Feel free to type in a question or a comment at any time, and we will certainly save some time towards the end of the presentation today for some discussion. So we're very glad that you're here joining us today, and I will turn it over to Melanie.
Thank you. Yes, just to mimic, you can comment or put questions at any point. You don't need to wait till the end, so you can throw them in the chat at any time. I can't see the chat, but Becky can, and so she's sort of helping field those. So if it's something that's relevant, right, to what we're talking about, then Becky can interrupt me and I'll respond to it. Or if it's kind of just the overall topic, we can save them for the end too. But yeah, you don't have to wait till the end. You can pop in and speak whenever you'd like. So this is the topic for today, which is a very vague, broad topic. But hopefully one of the main things that I hope we'll come away with is just a sense of normalizing being in emotional crisis, period. There are so many things that are taboo in our society to talk about. Emotions in general, negative emotions in general, being in crisis. There's still not, a ton of openness for kind of those more raw human everyday experiences that people have. So my hope is that by the end of today, we'll have a little bit more normalization of it, because we'll understand what is happening and why it's probably really appropriate that we're feeling that we're in crisis at different times, even if on the surface it may not appear to be a legitimate reason. We're going to show how under the surface it is incredibly appropriate and legitimate. Yeah. Here is our funding acknowledgement. So I'll give everybody a minute. And then I'm just going to go initially into a very, the most basic, bare bone, general definition of a crisis. I like this definition, which is basically just saying that we are in a state of crisis when our stressors outweigh our resources. Simple. And I like this definition because it takes out any judgments that can sometimes trickle in. I've noticed that myself or a lot of clients, when they're feeling emotional distress or in crisis, on top of that emotion, there's sometimes feelings of embarrassment, guilt, shame, self-hatred, maybe belittling, that we're over-exaggerating, things like that. So there's a lot of room for judgment, which can just kind of create more stress on top of stress. So this is a nice image for me because it helps take some of the judgment that we can sometimes have around what is or isn't a crisis out of it. So you can imagine the wide range that this scale can look like. So depending on the weight of each, the scale could be closer to even, or it could be as outweighed as completely possible. So for example, if you're a child, your resources are naturally going to be incredibly low and that you're completely dependent on others. You may have some natural resources like you're resilient, or you have some responsible, caring adults in your life, or creative outlets, things like that. But in general, your resources are very low as a child, which is what makes you more vulnerable. And so if your stressor is something like violence or abuse, the egregiousness of that is going to severely outweigh the limited resources that you would have. And again, this can differ, from person to person and across circumstances, but the scale kind of gives you a good idea of how kind of what the severity of crisis you could find yourself in could be. And crises can differ in severity, in duration, things like that. Kind of a more superficial or day-to-day example might be something like it's raining here in Florida where I am. You go out to do some errands and you forget your umbrella. Sometimes we'll put a judgment statement saying that, oh, that's not a crisis. By definition, just forgetting your umbrella, that's not a crisis. But absolutely, when you think about it in terms of relativity and what your resources are and what you're going through, that absolutely can be a crisis. Or for somebody else in a different circumstance or situation, that absolutely might not be a crisis. And so most people can relate to that experience of like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I totally lost my mind over XYZ, and might feel like that thing is something that is very small or isn't legitimate to put us into emotional distress. But we're going to talk about why that happens a lot and why that is often legitimate reasons. A lot of what's happening is not kind of superficial on the surface. A lot of what's happening is kind of underneath that. And so there's no rules about these XYZ are stressors and these are not stressful. It legitimately varies. A little bit of this I've said already, but just kind of wanting to really point out again how unique a crisis can present from person to person. I'm calling it a crisis or emotional distress or emotional crises because I tried to come up with just a broad umbrella term for different ways that people express being in distress or having unmet needs or having that imbalance of resources. And so some people express that through maybe a panic attack. Some people might express that through anxiety, racing thoughts, somebody else maybe binge eating or addiction of some sort, lashing out at people in our lives. So it really differs from person to person, but there's a common thread between all of these things. And so in some ways, it of course matters how it presents. There's different flavors and textures to every way that we present. But in other ways, the presentation of it all has a common thread. Like, it doesn't really matter how it's presenting. The point is it's letting us know that something is deeply out of balance, and that one way or another that's going to present itself. And again, it'll differ across person to person about how it presents. But I've noticed that sometimes there's some shame or judgment around how we express when we're in crisis. And again, reminding us that crisis is what is a crisis, meaning that it's not cute. It's often messy. So we're going to present in kind of messier, raw ways. And so, being in crisis doesn't involve like cute, pretty tears that we just kind of wipe away and get a hug. Like, it's often much more raw and messy than that. And so sometimes there's some judgment or like hatred or embarrassment around how we express being in crisis. And so again, part of today is to help normalize that we all experience that, we all express it in different ways, and that it's appropriate for it to be a messier expression. That can sometimes create harm. So we're going to talk about de-escalating, of course, but there's nothing inherently wrong or bad about the natural human experience of being in a crisis, having our resources and our stressors out of balance, and then having expression of that. Crises can be acute or persistent. So you could find yourself in a crisis that has a beginning and an ending. Maybe you have a really bad flight with really bad turbulence. That flight will begin and end at some point, and maybe that crisis will be over when you touch ground. Or of course, you can have a more persistent crisis, such as being maybe in an abusive relationship, maybe having ongoing depression, burnout. Work burnout is a really common persistent crisis that people find themselves in, poverty, things like that, where the crisis is ongoing. So they can show up in different ways. If you can, think about a time maybe recently that you found yourself feeling that your resources and your stressors were a bit out of balance. You'll probably notice that you had some indicators of that. Those can be physical, they could be interpersonal or relational, and they can also be emotional. An example for me is that when I find myself in distress, I have sort of different levels. In the beginning, when I'm distressed, I sort of find myself a little bit irritable. But then, kind of as my stress goes up and up, one physical symptom I have is I'll feel my throat kind of closing up. And I almost lost my voice one time, truly just from stress. So there's a lot of physical symptoms. Feel free to, throw in the chat if there are some that you notice you tend to have: racing heartbeat. Um, Migraines are very common for physical symptoms. When we're in crisis, we'll start to feel physical pain, IBS, migraines, sweaty palms, muscle tension. People experience heart palpitations, rashes. All kinds of physical symptoms can present when we're in a high stress circumstance or crisis. And again, this is even if there's no like physical threat. Like, it's not that you've gotten into a car accident and so then of course you have some muscle tension from the impact. These are coming from an emotional state that you're in, and so maybe there's no physical threat, but your physical body is still responding to it. Interpersonal indicators. I know for myself, I mentioned this earlier, when I'm in a crisis, I'm not as clear-headed or calm. I'm going to be a bit more irritable. I might lash out at others. I might, if I'm in a crisis, I may just not respond or cancel. Again, these are not inappropriate things. They're just patterns that may happen, and some people tend to lean more towards some than others. So yeah, noticing any relational indicators that might let you know that you're in a crisis, or how you tend to respond. Emotional symptoms are particularly common, and I'm going to show you a chart in this next slide too. But yeah, thinking about maybe a recent time when you had your stressors outweighing your resources, what were some of the emotions that you experienced? For one of my most recent ones, I was kind of reflecting on that as I was doing this. And I was like, I felt very alone, I felt very afraid, and I felt very just like inadequate. And so those are some of the ones that I had. And yeah, those are very uncomfortable feelings to be in. And so imagine if you're having all of these kind of symptoms coming up at once, your body is sort of letting you know, it's sending out like signals to you in different ways, letting you know that a crisis is happening. And so again, these are all really natural, appropriate things for mind, body, soul to kind of present and express when you're in that imbalance. I'm gonna talk a little bit more about the emotional part of it. This is very generic image. It's called the feeling wheel. There's millions of versions of them. They all kind of have this similar look, but maybe vary in specifics. So here's one version of it. And I show this up partly because I've noticed that when we're in crisis, a lot of what happens is we don't understand what we're experiencing. And some of that is genuinely like vocabulary based. So I encourage people to like have a screenshot of this on your phone or just like nearby. And also so that when you're in crisis, you can kind of have the opportunity to see what are the particular emotions that I'm experiencing. Am I feeling mad right now? Am I feeling anxious? Am I feeling resentful? Am I feeling terrified? Like, what is even happening? And that can already immediately start to ground us. So this is just kind of a resource I like for people to have. The other point that I want to mention here is that sometimes when we go into an emotional crisis over something that maybe on the surface feels like it shouldn't be, there can sometimes be themes to maybe some old wounds, some childhood trauma, things like that can be helpful for us to have awareness around. So I'm going to give an example for myself. So for me, some of the emotions that are particularly tender for me that tend to repeat, tend to throw me a little bit more into emotional crisis than others, are feeling rejected, excluded, and inadequate. Those are like a little bit more sensitive for me. Whereas like some other emotions like feeling jealous or feeling disrespected, or feeling maybe numb, those aren't as triggering for me. And so the ones that do tend to trigger me a little bit more, they kind of tie back to some of my childhood trauma, some of my old wounds, and people tend to have kind of some clusters of emotions that tend to be more triggering for them. And so it can be helpful to kind of know what those might be. For a lot of my clients who have experienced sexual violence in particular, things like feeling like certain emotions sometimes come up more often, like feeling really surprised, confused, shocked, like some of that confusion feeling can be really triggering for them. And so there may be an example where it could feel totally unrelated, but maybe they're, taking an exam, they're a student, and something is starting to confuse, didn't expect something, a type of question, and then they might have an emotional response that on the surface could maybe feel like, hey, it's okay, it's just a 10-point quiz, like don't worry about it. But our body is sort of digesting our emotional states and kind of remembering old wounds. And so it can be helpful to just kind of know. Related, a couple of those are in here. The other things that tend to trigger emotional crisis in general is the HALT, HALT acronym, hungry, angry, lonely, tired. So knowing that those types of stressors, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, have particular weight. And so, yeah, just knowing those when you're thinking about where your scale is at, hungry, angry, lonely, tired can really quickly move it from this to this. Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about what is happening for us. There's three kind of evolutionary parts of the brain, and they all have a little bit of a different function. So one part of our brain is really just kind of our keeping us alive, like our most basic survival instincts, making sure that we have food, water, going to the bathroom, sleeping, all that. The next one is managing our emotions. It's looking out for danger. It's helping you kind of assess and observe and interpret kind of the world around you and kind of see what needs to happen. And then the next one is more around logic, has room for some creativity, a little bit more perspective. And so together, these first two are the most kind of more primitive parts of your brain, make up your more emotional brain. And so they're alerting you to danger, and they're going to jumpstart your reactions, which is where you're going to get your fight, flight, or freeze response. And so those are going to come in. Those two parts of the brain are letting you know when those need to come in. And then your rational brain will kind of let you respond. So a little kind of example of that might be, before your rational brain weighs in to see if a threat is really a threat, you first kind of have that little fear or freeze up. So, for example, maybe you're coming home from work and you see a snake in your driveway. Some people love snakes, so maybe that's exciting, but let's pretend you're afraid of them, or, it scares you for a minute. And so you kind of jump. Your rational brain would come in when you realize, oh, that's not a snake, that's my garden hose. And then you would relax and everything would be fine. And so that's kind of how different parts of your brain are assessing for threats and then kind of determining how much threat is there. Once your rational brain comes in and you're like, oh, it's just the garden hose, everything is fine, you can kind of return back to like a more higher order of functioning. But for people who are in crisis mode, it's not possible. So if you're in a state of crisis, somebody could tell you over and over, like, it's a garden hose, but it's going to be really difficult for you to see that if you're in a state that is heightened enough. Or if you're somebody that has experienced trauma sort of repeatedly, then or crisis repeatedly, it's going to be more difficult for you to kind of accurately and perceive threats. So it can become more common for you to kind of jump and not have that other part of your brain kind of kick in to see that it's okay to relax. And so there's a lot of physical mental fatigue that comes in with having to kind of be hyper vigilant all the time, or to kind of go through life jumping and responding more frequently when things may not actually be threatening because of some past high threats or persistence or severity of threats in the past. It can be difficult later on to reduce those. So we're going to talk about a few strategies. I'm going to guide you through some examples of ones that can really help reground and bring that third part of our brain back, so that when it kind of flies off like this, these are some strategies that are going to help it come back on, put us back in our body. A lot of what's happening when we're in crisis or dissociating or having some sort of trauma response is that we can kind of leave the body. We leave the present moment and we kind of leave the now and we leave the body. So these are some things that are going to help bring that back down. So I'm going to go over these examples. And my disclaimer, even before I start going through them, is that figuring out what de-escalation works for you is a very unique, person-specific trial and error process. For some people, breathing techniques are just not accessible to them. That's perfectly fine. Don't feel that there's no other hopes for you to de-escalate or you have to force it in some way. That's perfectly fine. For other people, something else is more accessible. These are very kind of tried and true, highly supported, very, very beneficial. So I'm going to go over these, but we're going to talk in the next slide about kind of other more variety of options, because I think for some people, these can feel not accessible, but if they can be accessible for you, or if there's something that you can try, they're just incredibly beneficial. Lots of good research on it. And yeah, we'll talk some more. I'm getting probably a little bit ahead of myself. So I want to just go through, explain what a few of these are, let you go ahead and try them out as well. So for some of the breathing strategies so let's say you're finding yourself starting to escalate too, you might find that like if you're a 2 out of 10, breathing is totally accessible. But once you get to like a 5 out of 10, breathing's no longer accessible. Now you need to go sit outside once you're at a 5 out of 10. So it kind of depends on what level of crisis you find yourself in. And again, this is all around kind of learning about how you present, how you express, and different strategies that work for you depending on what level that you're at. And so we'll try a few of these now. So box breathing, really simple. It's the idea that you're breathing in and out for the same count, and then you're holding in between. So I guess it's sort of like a box. So for example, you're breathing in for 1, 2, 3, 4, hold. 1, 2, 3, 4, out. 1, 2, 3, 4, hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's sort of like you're making a little bit of a box. So you're even breathing in, hold, out evenly, hold, back in. So equal breathing in and out. This is going to help you kind of have something to focus on. It's also putting oxygen back into your brain. It's helping you physically get more oxygen back into your brain, and it's going to help ground you. Another type of breathing is called diaphragmatic, or some people just call it belly breathing. It's really common for us to hold our stomachs in just all the time. And so if you're doing it right now, take a notice of it, let your belly hang out, let it like be free. Really kind of reducing the physical tension is going to help reduce kind of all of the tension of stress and crisis. So for this, what you're making sure you're doing is you're letting your belly hang out. And when you breathe in, your belly should go out. If you think about how a baby breathes, they're naturally kind of doing belly breathing. Somewhere along the way, we start breathing in and sucking our stomach in, and then breathing out and letting the belly out. So we're flipping that. We're going to breathe in through the nose. Your belly is going to push out while you breathe in. When you breathe out, your stomach will kind of fall back in. So it can be helpful to place your hands on your stomach when you're doing that, but these are two types of breathing that could be really good. This one is also really good. It's this one's kind of similar to like breathing into a bag, which is kind of old school, but actually really effective and good as well. Alternate nostril technique. So take your any fingers you want. These are the two I use. And what you're going to do is you're going to close one nostril, breathe in through one, plug that one, breathe out through the other. Now you're going to breathe back in through the same nose, plug, breathe out through the other. And you're going to repeat that. It takes a little bit more focus maybe than the box breathing, but it has some really nice benefits. So that's the alternate nostril breathing. There are all kinds of YouTube videos that can guide you through and lead you through them as well. But the diaphragmatic breathing, the box breathing especially, these are ones that you can do out in public with very little, attention being pulled toward yourself. The other strategy that's really helpful is using the 5 senses for grounding. Grounding is exactly what it sounds like. It's grounding ourselves back in our body. And so the 5 senses are listed here. And this is also something that you can do at any time. So even sitting right here in my room, part of one of the ways that I can ground if I feel myself escalating, is taking a minute to sit. People have different styles of how they like to do this, but there's always the 5 senses that you can tap into. You might think that it's perfectly quiet, but there's always something to hear. Maybe the clicking of your fan, the rain outside, maybe the buzzing of a fly in your room. There's always kind of something to take notice of. So you can do it by whatever's naturally around you, or you can do it with something a little bit more stimulating than that. So if you wanted to use sound, some examples of some more stimulating ones could be maybe like literally blasting your favorite music. So something really kind of loud. You could read a book out loud. You can focus on the ticking of the clock on a wall. So you're kind of looking for sound. So you can also do it more specifically. Something like touch. You can run your hands through hot or cold water, splash cold water on your face. Hold an ice cube in your hand. So you can make it as sort of active or passive as you want. A lot of the time, sight is particularly one of the most helpful ones. And so if you feel yourself starting to escalate, taking a note of what is in your room, what's around you, and listing it out either out loud or in your head. Curtains, desk, coffee mug, and kind of starting to re-ground yourself into the present and where you physically are. Another strategy, progressive muscle relaxation. When we're in stress or crisis, we're starting to tighten up our muscles. And so part of what we're doing is we're trying to give ourselves an opportunity to let our muscles relax. And that's going to help ground. That's going to help like our nervous system settle, things like that. And so basically what you're doing is different parts of your body, you can tighten them and then loosen them. So for example, your hands, you can make a fist really tight and then relax them. Oftentimes you won't notice how tight our bodies already are until we exaggerate it and then loosen it. You might notice even right now, wherever you're sitting, a lot of the time people's jaws are clenched. So you might notice right now you had no awareness that your jaw was clenched this whole time. You can just let it drop. Or maybe brows being furrowed is also really common. Shoulders up high is really common. So just go ahead and let everything kind of drop. And so one way to do that is by starting by exaggerating it, holding your shoulders up really high to your ears, and then letting them drop. And so these are that's another strategy that you can use. You can do it for your legs, pushing your thighs together really, really tight and then letting them relax. Shoulders, feet, you can curl your toes really tight. And so just kind of getting back into your body. So these are kind of some really general examples. Almost finished. 2 more slides I want to talk about, and then we'll see what questions or comments you might have. This initially is hard for me to show because it's not exact. I'm really happy about the push toward more self-care, but I always want to make sure that I'm clear that self-care is not like oh, take a bubble bath and like your childhood trauma is going to be fine. Like that's clearly really just dismissive and minimizing and not enough. Um, but what I am talking about is having a sense of what are your resources. So when you think about your stressors and you think about your resources, identifying what your resources are, and having those be as diverse as possible. So you might have some resources like a favorite cup of tea that just feels really warm. It's really enjoyable. You like the smell of it. Like it just feels really cozy. Yeah, and you just enjoy that, versus like really, helpful relationships where you can be yourself, you feel supported, people can come be there with you, whatever it may be. So you want a wide diversity and range and texture in the different resources that you have. And oftentimes it's checking in with ourselves because our crises can also sneak up on us. And so it's also checking in with ourselves of like, yeah, how many times this year did I take days off from work or go to the movies or spend time with a friend or take a nap or sleep, so this is really more about creating a lifestyle that is really radical. So when we talk about self-care, that's always discussed in a radical way, not in a superficial or like simplistic way. That part of what we're saying is that there's a lot of violence in our society and in our world, and that violence can be physical, it can be emotional, it can be relational. There's a lot of forms of violence. It can be in the way that we speak to ourselves and in the ways that we treat ourselves. And so having a resource list is about adding really more nonviolence into our lives. And so even though when you look at these words, like I sort of cringe because I'm like, oh, this looks so like superficial and like not important. But so please know that the spirit behind this is very radical in nature. And so I really encourage people that when it comes to de-escalating yourself, having a really diverse set of resources. So whether breathing is included in that, or maybe you know that breathing only works if you need to de-escalate from a 2 or a 3. But once that you're at a higher level, you might need another option of ways to de-escalate. Really giving yourself the time and space to know what works for you and what provides you that benefit. I'll quickly differentiate our resources from our addictions because those can look really similar. So for example, going to the gym can very much be a resource. A resource is something that even after it's over, you're feeling really, you still reap the benefits of that grounding. Whereas addiction, as soon as that's over, it's done. And so going to the gym can be really addictive for people that as soon as they leave, their anxiety or whatever it might be is right back. For other people, that can be more of a resource. Same thing, something like having a glass of wine can of course be an addiction of some sort, or absolutely it can be a resource. And so there's again, it's very unique person to person, but just looking for, not something that makes you feel good in the moment, but as soon as it's over, it's done. Those tend to be a little bit more addictions and don't help with our stressors as much. So just wanting to check in with yourself about that. And then I'll end with this, some of my favorite quotes again, just to kind of, when we're talking about caring for ourselves, understanding that we're in a state of crisis. That is a form of care, to understand what we're going through and to take care of ourselves during it and to try to de-escalate ourselves and offer ourselves care or compassion during it is a very radical thing to do. And so just included some of my favorite quotes to show like kind of that this is like a spiritual lifestyle based thing. And that everything in the momentum of society is going to lead you away from it. So long working hours, a lot of responsibilities, like inflation, like politics, so many things are going to push us away from taking care of ourselves. And so it's very radical, and it's definitely a lifestyle change to want to understand, what am I going through? How can I see it as legitimate? How can I help myself be more nonviolent or take care or reduce harm as much as possible? And seeing that as worthwhile. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm open now for any comments or discussion that people might be interested in. The same presentation will be in a couple of weeks as well.
Great, thank you, Melanie. Another great, great presentation. We do have a couple of questions. One, when I'm coming down from a stressful situation, I tend to reach for snack food without really even thinking about it. It seems to calm me down, but I know that it isn't healthy. What can I do to avoid doing this?
That's a really good example because it's one of those that can totally be a resource or addiction. And what I don't want people to do is like police themselves too much. So there's a few options. One is that reaching for like a particular snack, you could actually use that in grounding using taste. But what you'll want to do is really take your time to taste the food. So sometimes when we like emotionally eat or stress eat, which is just like so common, we're not actually tasting our food. There's sort of more of like that chemical like salty sweet process that's happening to try to self-soothe. And so part of what one option could be trying to continue to do that, but just really taking the time to be a little bit more mindful as opposed to mindless and just really tasting your food. And so it can be a way to continue to ground while tasting. And so that could be fine. You can also just ask yourself if kind of after I do that to kind of ground or kind of come down from a stressful situation, once that snack is over, how am I feeling? And so if you're feeling like that helped you do that, that's perfectly fine. If you're feeling like it's leading toward like as soon as the snack is over, I'm back toward feeling this way, or I have to do it until like a point of like binging or discomfort, then you may just need some substitution. So it's all about reducing harm. So for all of this, there's no judgment like, oh, this is like good or bad way to like come down from something. It's more about what is the least harmful way to come down. And so, for example, like you might find that a sugary snack is less harmful way to come down than all my examples right now feel a little intense, than some other method of coming down. And so it's okay. Or you might find there's a less harmful way than the sugary snack. Like maybe so I hope that's answered your question. Again, it's so person specific. It's a little bit difficult. So it sort of depends on if that strategy causes more distress or not. And if it doesn't, because lots of things fall into that, like diet culture and like all kinds of other stuff. Food is a big, it's really loaded. So that's where sometimes like having someone to talk through that with can be helpful, to just kind of rule out some things. I hope I've somewhat answered, but please include a follow-up. If not.
Great, thank you. And another question that came in, how can I help my partner when I see that they are escalating emotionally?
I would use the feeling wheel if possible. The feeling wheel is really going to ground people. So if you can point out you don't have to like show it to them, but if you can kind of figure out what they're feeling and state it to them, that's going to be really soothing. So you're feeling frustrated, whatever it may be. And so some of it is that vocabulary. We really often don't have it. So I would say kind of check out that vocabulary. You can go through it together with your partner. And saying like, hey, do you feel like there are certain ones here that are a little bit more tender for you? And so that you both can know that that may be what's happening and you can reflect those to them. The certain emotions that you think you're observing can be helpful. Other things could be like creating a very soft physical space as well. That could be like corner in a closet with like your favorite candle. Like it could be like that, or it can be as robust, like a whole closet with like a weighted blanket and everything. And so trying to create soft spaces for people to like land and take care, or helping them going through the breathing together. I mean, of course, you're going to want to ask your partner, like, like, would any of these things be helpful? And like, what might you like and things like that? Because again, it is so unique person to person. But I think that once you start practicing it for yourself, it might help you have a little bit more confidence as well in kind of supporting other people who are also needing to de-escalate. Yeah. Sorry, I can't give like a super specific example, but I hope that helps a little bit.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. And another question, when should someone seek emergency help when experiencing a crisis versus trying the different techniques?
Yeah, so these are all like kind of prevention based. I mean, if there's like physical unsafety, so you're having like really intense suicidal ideation, and you're not sure if you're going to feel safe, something like that. Maybe sometimes you can end up in enough crisis that maybe you're not quite sure, like you sort of aren't quite oriented to like where you are or what's happening. And so if there's like a sense that you're not going to be physically safe, there's usually like 24/7 crisis lines, suicide hotlines. I mean, I also encourage people to have, like, if you know that there's something kind of coming up in your life, depending how acute or persistent this is, and depending if you have people in your life to be there for you, also having like neighbors, friends, family, if you don't have any relationships like that, then it would probably be relying on like the 24/7 emergency resources in your area. I also encourage people to use those before they get to a 10, because it can be hard to try something new. If you've never called a hotline before, I would encourage you doing that maybe when you're at a 5 or a 6. It would still be really helpful, and maybe it's not as intimidating to do because you're not all the way at a 10 yet. And that can give you some good exposure to the process of it. It can be hard to try something new and reach out for emergency like 24/7 help once you're already at a 10. But yeah, physical safety, then it would be more emergent than that. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So I don't have other questions at this point, but we'll give folks a chance to kind of think through and if they have other questions or comments. Really, really good questions, though. So as you're talking through, some different examples of things, I'm thinking just from the perspective of like parenthood, that this could even be really helpful techniques to teach children, just in terms of, being able to recognize when they're having kind of an emotional reaction to things, and how they can help themselves to kind of de-escalate from that. Do you find that these techniques are helpful with children as well as adults?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't work specifically with children, but yeah, there's a lot of techniques around like even like time in instead of time out, which is where, because time out, and I don't want to get into like too much parenting debate, because I'm sure time out has really good like behavioral things as well. So I'm not kind of offering what's better or not, but just as like a typical example, people have heard of timeout. So sometimes people will have something called, instead of timeout, there's time in. That's where they'll do like the calm down corner. A lot of people include something like a feeling wheel in the calm down corner, include things that are soothing, favorite books, only books, certain types of books though. Maybe little weighted blanket or certain things like that, and that you can either be in there alone or with somebody. So sometimes people want to go to the calm down corner by themselves, or they want like an adult figure with them to calm down. But yeah, I mean, part of it is that there's not like a punishment around having an emotional reaction, because again, you're expressing an unmet need. It may not always be the most productive or helpful way, but but the expression in general is legitimate. And so as we're all learning, Yeah, learning is never, a perfect, pretty process that, we go through. We hurt people's feelings as we're learning, or we hurt ourselves while we're learning. But yeah, there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of benefit of how newer generations are being taught some of these things a little bit earlier, and they're supporting each other a little bit more in some ways, just like as the taboo and as it's become more normal to talk about things like emotions in general, mental health. Yeah.
Great. We did have one more question that came through. Many of the breathing techniques you mentioned sound similar to yoga. Would you recommend yoga for dealing with stress?
Lots of things that are mind body related are going to be very helpful for prevention, because a lot of what's happening is that when we go through a trauma, there's sort of a break between mind, body, spirit. Those things sort of start to create distance between one another. We want them to all come back together. It's a very crude way of kind of, saying that. And so things like yoga can be anything movement based can be really helpful, because you're integrating hopefully all of them: breath, movement, mind. There's sort of a spiritual aspect. Yoga, like therapy, there's a whole wide range of philosophies and practitioners. So just like how it can be a resource or an addiction, I've seen people use yoga as just like the most grounding resource, like just such a true resource that you can always have access to, like in your home. But I've also seen it be an addiction, something that moves into like performative perfectionism, can move into body stuff. It can move into like self-image and other things, so like anything, you have to kind of check in with yourself. But in general, things like yoga, dance, like movement-based things tend to be, really good for us.
Great. Thank you. And along those lines, on Survivor Space, we do have a link to some trauma-informed yoga resources. So if yoga is something that you're interested in learning more about or trying as a survivor, there are some very kind of gentle, trauma-informed ways to kind of introduce yoga into your sort of self-care routine, if that's something that's of interest to you. So definitely feel free to check that out.
Yeah, acupuncture can be like that as well. It's helpful for the practitioner to, if you're coming in specifically with trauma, that there is, like an understanding, because a lot can come up. Same thing with massage therapy. Most people have heard of, if you've gotten a massage, like next thing you know, you're crying and you're like, what's happening? And so, just making sure that you're like in a place that is safe and respectful and gentle. Important.
That's great. Well, I know we have come to the end of our time for today's session. Great information, Melanie. Thank you so much, and great questions. Thank you all for contributing to the discussion here. As Melanie mentioned, this session will be offered again next Thursday. So obviously you're welcome to join us again. And certainly if you know others who may benefit from this topic, please, let them know that the session will be happening again next week. I will leave the chat up for a while yet today. So if there are additional questions that anyone has or follow-up comments, please feel free to put those in on the Survivor Space site. But for now, thank you again, Melanie, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And we hope to see you next time. Thanks so much.